sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fiery orange and deep purple. Shadows crept across the old farmhouse, stretching like fingers across the worn dirt path. The air was thick with the scent of hay and a hint of impending storm. This was the moment when the world would hold its breath, unaware that danger lurked just around the corner, waiting to spring. Inside the farmhouse, Marvin, a weathered farmer with hands that told stories of toil, sat quietly at the kitchen table. He had spent his life on this land, nurturing crops and raising animals, but most importantly, guarding his home. He knew each creak of the old wooden floors, the rattle of the windows in the evening breeze. Tonight, however, there was another sound. A whisper of anticipation swirled through the air. Just beyond the reach of the farmhouse's dim interior light, three shapes stalked through the fields, wrapped in the shadows of dusk. They moved confidently, muscles taut and eyes gleaming with hunger, not for food but for an easy score. They looked at Marvin's farm and all they saw was abandonment. Empty fields, a rusted tractor, a disused barn creaking in the wind. "They'll never see us coming," one of them said, his voice a low snicker that seemed to float on the still air. He was young, perhaps barely out of his teens, filled with bravado and naivety. His two accomplices nodded, their faces hard with determination, eyes darting nervously but fueled by greed. What they failed to understand was that the farm wasn't empty. It thrummed with life, tenacity, and a farmer's unwavering will. Marvin had seen storms before, literal and metaphorical, and he was ready for anything that dared disturb his peace. As the shadows deepened, the trio crept toward the back door. A plan formed in their minds, each footfall muffled by the rich earth. Unbeknownst to them, Marvin was still at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee steaming beside him as he listened intently. He had spent countless nights like this, waiting for storms, waiting for the inevitable challenges that life threw their way. Their footsteps sounded like thunder in the otherwise quiet night. Each step was clumsier than the last, filled with an eagerness that would soon turn to fear. The youngest of the three reached for the door, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped the handle. This was it, the moment when everything would shift. But just as he twisted the knob, the door swung open with a gut-wrenching creak, echoing through the empty corridors of the farm. In that split second, time seemed to freeze. The three robbers were met not with silence or chaos, but with something more powerful, an unexpected presence. Marvin stood there, silhouetted against the light from the kitchen, his face calm yet intense. The confidence radiated off him like warmth from the sun, striking the intruders with an invisible force. The anticipation that buzzed in the air was replaced with an electric shock of realization. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, his voice low and steady. The look on their faces was priceless, their bravado splintered into confusion and panic. It was as if they had walked into the jaws of a lion, fully unaware until the very last moment. Their plans, so carefully crafted, now lay in tatters at their feet. Stammered the youngest one, his bravado faltering as he stepped back, the doorway now a barrier between fear and rage. "We just thought. Borrow. This is my home, boys," Marvin replied, stepping forward, palms open, revealing an absence of fear but an abundance of resolve. In that moment, possibility hung in the air like smoke. Maybe they'd retreat, back off to whatever darkness churned in their past. Maybe the reality of their choices would dawn on them. Or maybe they'd lash out, blind with desperation. Marvin had seen both. He knew fear could drive a man to madness. He had danced with the shadows before, but he also knew his land, its rhythms, its quirks, and its secrets. Unbeknownst to the intruders, he had an ally, a well-placed shovel leaning against the doorframe. It was simple, metal, and strong, a farmer's weapon perfect for swift justice. Suddenly, the older partner lunged forward, thinking he could tackle Marvin, but Marvin was quicker. With a swift motion, he grabbed the shovel and swung it with all the strength honed from years of labor. The sound of metal clanging against flesh echoed in the air, a brutal harmony that signaled his readiness to defend what he held dear. The noise startled the last robber, who stepped back, his eyes wide with terror. Fear can turn men into beasts, but it can also turn them into prey, and in an instant, that instinct seized the three of them. Adrenaline surged through their bodies as they felt the air shift. their plans dissolving into moments of chaos. As the first robber stumbled back, clutching his side, Marvin's voice cut through the confusion like a knife. "You think this is a game? You think I'm just some old farmer waiting to be picked off? My family built this place brick by brick." For a heartbeat, everything hung in the balance. The choice was laid bare like the land outside, raw and unforgiving. The would-be thieves exchanged quick glances, their minds racing through escape plans, assessing the odds stacked against them. Marvin stood firm, a fortress of strength ready to protect what was his. Then slowly the young one stepped back, pulling the others with him. "Come on, man. We don't want any trouble," he pleaded, his voice cracking slightly, the bravado that had once fueled their mission now an echo of cowardice. "I didn't want trouble either," Marvin replied, lowering the shovel, his heart still pounding but steadying. One by one, they retracted their steps, adrenaline cocktailing with newfound fear. They glanced at each other, anticipation for violence fading into a desperate urgency to retreat. And just like that, the night shifted again, the mad dash for exit overshadowing their audacity. Marvin watched them go, a whirlwind of emotions stirring within him. Anger simmered just beneath the surface, but so too did a sense of clarity. His life had been bruised by storms and intrusions before, but no one could take what was built with blood, sweat, and tears. As they sprinted away, their footfalls thundering in the night, Marvin leaned against the door frame, letting the chill of the evening air wash over him. For a moment, he allowed his thoughts to linger on the vulnerability of it all, the way life could change in a second, how determination could shine even in the darkest hours. He looked back into his house, the familiar halo of light illuminating the worn photos on the wall, the faces of family, moments captured in time. They had known hardship, but had also known triumph. And as Marvin took a deep breath, he realized this was just another chapter in a story far larger than himself. The world outside remained unchanged. The field still whispered in the wind, the cows still lazily stirred in the barn. But in that fleeting moment of confrontation, the world had shifted. Marvin had faced duplicitous greed, and he had won, not through violence, but through unwavering resolve and the heartbeat of a man who knew the worth of his home. Life would continue on this farm, as it had for generations. Perhaps in the future, a different storm would blow through. But Marvin would be ready for it, for he was not merely a farmer. He was a guardian of his legacy, a protector of stories yet to unfold. And as the clouds rolled dark and heavy in the far distance, he stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind him, cradling the warmth of his home, where shadows danced and memories whispered. The quiet resilience of a man who had stood against the odds, who had faced the night head-on, and had emerged unscathed, ready to live another day. The night was deceptively quiet, the kind that wrapped the old farmhouse in shadows, only to be disrupted by the restless stir of wind brushing through the fields. As the clock on the wall ticked steadily toward midnight, 3 men hid just outside the edge of the farm, silhouetted against the dim glow of the porch light. They exchanged nervous glances, a shared understanding hanging thick in the air. Tonight, they would strike. "Look," whispered the youngest, a wiry figure with eyes that burned with a mix of fear and adrenaline. "It's just an old farm. No one's around." The leader, tall and broad, nodded, but his brow was furrowed. "I don't know. Something about this place feels off." Ignoring the instinct that had once kept him out of trouble, he shrugged off the sensation and turned toward the house. They slipped through the tall grass, approaching the back door, a plan formed in mind and desperation driving their actions. As they neared the entry, they got a clearer picture of what would soon become their target: rusty farming tools, a couple of empty crates. To them, it looked like a graveyard of forgotten treasures, ripe for the taking. Inside, sitting at the kitchen table, was Marvin, an aging farmer whose face was weathered by years of labor and challenge. A mountain of a man in attitude and stature, he had learned to embrace the quiet nights on his own terms. He wasn't alone, though. He had the weight of his history, the legacy of his family home wrapped around him like a well-worn blanket. Tonight, he had gathered a hefty flashlight, not for light, but as his ally. He knew the land that surrounded him like the back of his hand, and he understood what it meant to protect it. It was more than just soil and crops. It was his life's work, built with sweat and resilience, and that was worth defending. As the younger robber reached for the door handle, the creak echoed into the stillness of the night, vibrating with the tension that hung heavy in the air. The moment stretched out, and just as he pushed the door open, expecting to meet an empty night, he was met instead with an unexpected presence. Marvin stood at the edge of the kitchen, staring into the darkness, a faint glimmer of determination reflected in his eyes. He asked, his voice as steady as a rock. The atmosphere shifted, the robbers froze at the threshold, realizing that perhaps this wasn't going as they had hoped. What they had mistaken for a mere farmhouse was, in fact, a fortress of memories, stories, and pride. Marvin embodied all of that, a living testament to tenacity. We didn't mean any harm," stammered the youngest, his bravado whispering away into the shadows. He took a hesitant step back, looking to his accomplices for reassurance, but found only fear mirrored in their eyes. Marvin replied, taking a step closer, the floorboards creaking underfoot. The other two robbers exchanged glances, their previous confidence cracking against the wall of Marvin's calm demeanor. They had prepared for an empty house, easy pickings. The idea of confronting an actual human being, a protector of this land, sent a wave of unease washing over them. "Look," said the leader, his voice tinged with forced bravado. "We're just looking for some stuff." Marvin's expression hardened, and the brief flicker of fear they had exposed ignited a fire within him. "This isn't stuff, gentlemen. These are my crops, my livestock, my way of life." Feeling the adrenaline pulse through him, Marvin instinctively grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward them. The beam pierced the darkness, illuminating their startled faces. In that stark moment of clarity, he became more than just a farmer. He was ready to defend everything he cherished. The youngest one considered the possibility of turning back, but the leader insisted. "You don't want to do this," he warned, stepping forward, feigning confidence. But the deepening panic in his friend's eyes betrayed their facade. Marvin stepped into the light, the intensity in his gaze unnerving them. "Try me," he challenged. The air thickened, and he could feel their hesitation crackling like static electricity. Then, as if the night itself had sensed the tension, a loose board beneath their feet splintered loudly, sending the trio stumbling back in sheer shock. There was no escape route now. Uncertainty curled around them like vines, trapping them as surely as fear gripped their hearts. Whispered the youngest, his voice barely audible, a tremor betraying his bravado. The leader barked. He'd seen enough. The plan was unraveling before their eyes, and desperation screamed for action. But it was too late. It turned out they weren't the only ones prepared for confrontation. Marvin seized that moment. Determined to protect his home and his legacy, he rushed forward, swinging the flashlight with precision and strength, catching the leader off guard. The heavy thud echoed through the air as the flashlight struck the intruder, fueling the power of adrenaline running through Marvin's veins. Marvin shouted, his voice thunderous, reverberating through the walls. His heart pounded like an engine, each beat pushing him forward, driven by a primal instinct to protect. The two remaining robbers recoiled in panic, their sense of security collapsing in on itself. As the youngest darted toward the door, realizing he was trapped, his eyes widened in horror. Panic clawed at his voice as he glanced back at Marvin, who stood as a guardian against their chaos, a titan of resolve. "Leave." "Now," Marvin urged again, not with the intent to simply drive them off his land, but to forge a path that could lead them away from a life defined by theft and desperation. He knew the fear that wrapped around them, how it could drive men to do things they regretted. With trembling hands, the youngest pushed the door back, the metal screeching in protest against the wood. It swung open, and in a flash, the two remaining robbers bolted, fear carrying them away faster than they had come. Marvin watched them disappear into the night, adrenaline still pulsing through him, every moment hanging like a breath held too long. The world outside remained unchanged, the fields, the barn, the rusted tractor. But within him, strength filled the space where fear had briefly settled. He had marked this boundary, he had claimed his ground. He stepped back into the kitchen, his heart still racing, thoughts swirling like autumn leaves swept up in a gust of wind. It was a breathless silence now, the only sound the rustling of the night. The shadows seemed to breathe with him, the familiar surroundings returning to their quiet existence. After a moment, Marvin picked up the flashlight, its surface cool against his palm. He took a deep breath, swallowing down the adrenaline that still fluttered in his chest, a wild bird waiting to escape. This land was more than just dirt and crops. It was his inheritance, a legacy of perseverance. He leaned against the table for a moment, collecting himself, allowing the gravity of what just happened to settle. Life had tested him before. Storms had ravaged his fields, losses had darkened his doorstep. Yet here he was still unswayed. In the stillness, Marvin allowed himself a moment of reflection. The confrontation was more than just a clumsy robbery, it was a reminder of what truly mattered, protecting what was his at any cost. He considered those young men, caught in their own desperation. They too were products of their environment, choices made under the weight of hardship and fear. But they had a choice, didn't they? In that moment, as they ran from him, Marvin hoped they would find another path. Perhaps they would see that there was more to life than easy scores and shadows lurking in the night. Maybe, just maybe, they could learn from this experience just as he had learned from his own struggles. With a deep, steadying breath, he flicked the flashlight off, casting the kitchen back into that warm, golden glow. A sense of peace washed over him, powerful in its simplicity. Outside, the stars twinkled like scattered diamonds, a beacon for those who chose to find their way home. Marvin knew tomorrow would come with its own challenges, its own lessons wrapped in trials. The world continued to spin outside of his grasp, but he was ready for it. He would face whatever came next, be it storm or intruder, because this land was his heart, and he would defend it fiercely. As he sat back down, the weight of the night settled into a resolute calm. The farmhouse stood firm against the darkness, a sanctuary of endurance, waiting for the new dawn to embrace it. And Marvin, the guardian of his heritage, remained vigilant, ready for whatever lay ahead, stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever to protect the life he had built. The farmhouse loomed against the backdrop of a twilight sky, dark and foreboding on that chilly autumn night. Crickets chirped their lamenting song, while distant thunder rumbled softly, announcing an approaching storm. Just inside the creaky wooden door, in the heart of that seemingly empty home, Marvin waited. He'd learned long ago that looks could deceive. To the casual observer, the farm appeared deserted, its fields stretching like a forgotten quilt, the crops dancing in the wind. But Marvin knew something they didn't. An empty farm was an invitation to trouble, especially for desperate souls. Tonight, he had a feeling. The kind of feeling a man develops after years of tending the land. With every muscle in his body honed by toil and sweat, Marvin settled into a chair at the kitchen table. A single lamp flickered softly, casting deep shadows that cloaked the corners of the room. He sipped his coffee slowly, keen eyes trained on the edge of the property. Not far from the farm, 3 figures crouched in the overgrown grass. They huddled together, the dying light of day playing tricks on their minds. The leader, Jake, was a wiry man with an anxious glint in his eyes, darting between the barn and the house. He whispered, the brittle edge to his voice revealing his uncertainty. "Yeah, man. It's just an old farmhouse," said Mike, his companion, attempting to sound confident while his own voice wavered. They had talked big in the car, fueled by dread and desperation. They needed money, quick cash to settle debts no one could bear to acknowledge. With a deep breath, Jake nodded, squaring his shoulders. "Let's just get in and out." But as they crept toward the back door, the youngest of the trio, a kid named Tim, lingered a step behind. His voice trembled slightly, betraying his fear. Jake shot him an impatient glare. "We won't." With hushed urgency, they approached the weathered door, its paint peeling, hinges rusting. The sight of it sent a shiver down Tim's spine, but he swallowed hard, drawing courage from his friends. He couldn't turn back now. The thought of it was too humiliating. Inside, Marvin was acutely aware. He could hear every rustle of grass, every murmur of wind outside. He had grown up on stories of the land, tales of thieves and heroes. He felt that night was a foreboding echo of those old stories, layering the present with dread, courage, and a touch of fate. As if answering his thoughts, the back door creaked open wide and he saw them. 3 shadows against the backdrop of fading light. They stepped hesitantly into his kitchen, eyes darting like frightened rabbits. Jake demanded, resolve hardening his voice, but the trembling in his hands betrayed him. Marvin leaned back in his chair, the chair groaned beneath him. "You're in the wrong place, boys," he replied, his voice calm and steady as running water. "This isn't some easy target." Tim's eyes widened, his fear battling with uncertainty. "We just need money," Marvin asked, pushing away the thought of the boy's vulnerability for a boy he was. Those words landed heavy in the air, startling them. They needed more than just cash. They needed to fill the void within themselves. Marvin could see it etched on their young faces: doubt, fear, lost dreams. Marvin's voice rang clear, firm, resonating with the weight of wisdom. The boys had painted him as a frail old man, but he was built of far stronger stuff. Jake took a step forward, emboldened by bravado but thwarted by doubt. He yelled, the desperation in his voice unraveling with every syllable. "That's not how this works," Marvin replied, rising from his chair. He towered over them, his form casting a long shadow across the worn wooden floor. Even in that moment of tension, he felt a profound sadness for what these boys had turned to. He remembered being young, filled with dreams, and how quickly they could turn into nightmares. "I'm not afraid of you," Marvin continued, his firm stance unyielding like the oak trees that lined the edges of his fields. The air crackled with the energy of uncertainty and hesitation, a sharp contrast to the simmering yet dormant violence coursing through Jake. In a desperate move, Jake lunged forward, reaching for Marvin. But it was a mistake rooted in panic. Marvin, quick as a hawk, dodged and seized a heavy iron skillet from the counter nearby. The clang of metal on metal echoed through the kitchen like a thunderclap, resonating with primal rawness. Marvin bellowed, his voice shaking the very windows of the house. The boys froze momentarily, eyes wide with shock. The truth dawned upon them. They were not up against some frail old man, but a force of nature, the embodiment of years spent battling unforgiving lands. Marvin pointed the skillet at them, and for a brief moment, fear flickered through the trio, twisting the tension into something palpable and thick. Jake hesitated, weighing his options as regret flooded his senses. Running felt like an escape. Confrontation felt like slipping into darkness. Marvin urged, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of compassion. "You don't want to do this." But desperation clouded Jake's thoughts, shoving aside any lingering doubt. He shouted, "You don't know my life." At his words, Tim looked from Jake to Marvin, uncertainty swimming in his young eyes. He whispered almost to himself, the hint of insanity in desperation's dance pulling him closer to a cliff. "I won't let you," Marvin said firmly, raising the skillet higher. In that instant, time seemed suspended. They were all suspended in a moment that could turn explosive at any second. It felt like the eye of a storm, the world holding its breath before chaos erupted. Tim suddenly shouted, a raw urgency tearing through him. But it was too late for Jake. His pride, the bravado that had steered them into this moment, was crumbling faster than he could grasp. He shouted, heart pounding. Marvin, still towering, took a step forward. "You've taken nothing but a few moments of your lives." The words struck a chord, whether they wanted it to or not. Jake faltered, and in that moment of hesitation, a mix of fear and clarity broke through. Maybe they weren't thieves, maybe they were just lost. Tim looked toward the door, drawn by the urgency to escape but wanting to stay. He could feel the cold sweat on his brow and the sinking weight in his stomach. "Maybe we should go," he said softly, the fight draining from him. Tim shouted, his voice breaking. At that, everything moved at once. The three young men stumbled back, eyes darting toward the door as if it were a lifeline. Fear beat against them like hammers, urging them to break free from the nightmare their lives had become. Marvin, sensing the shift, lowered the skillet. He shouted again, his voice echoing in the space they had created. As if the deluge poured forth, they turned and fled, the door slamming behind them, a cacophony of chaos fading into the darkness. The storm began to brew in earnest, distant rumblings echoing Marvin's own heart. Silence regained its foothold in the farmhouse. Marvin stood there for a moment, the weight of the skillet in his hand feeling heavier than it ever should. His heart was pounding, but it wasn't from fear. It was a mix of anger for them and disappointment in the world reflected in their eyes. Minutes passed, and the quietness of the night enveloped him once more. The echo of their retreat faded, lost to the sound of rustling leaves and the soft patter of rain that began to fall, each drop hammering against the window panes, like the judgment of a world that had pushed them into darkness. Marvin set the skillet down, a mix of grief and determination swirling within him. He couldn't blame them entirely. They were trapped in a cycle of poverty and desperation. He had seen it creep into the lives of families around him, and he had vowed to break the cycle wherever he could. The storm outside intensified, harmonizing with his thoughts. He stepped back into the living room, surveying the walls adorned with photographs of his ancestors, remembrances of sacrifices made and battles fought. Those memories inspired him, urging him to embrace hope amidst struggle. That night, he sat quietly, heart still racing, but with a deeper understanding of the world outside. The universe was complicated, messy, fragmented. But if he could meet that darkness with kindness and strength, perhaps he could change not just one life, but many. Marvin knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, more stories and perhaps more encounters. But as he leaned back in his chair and listened to the rhythm of the rain, he felt a surge of resilience. He was ready for whatever came next, equipped not just with his iron skillet, but a heart rooted in compassion. After all, a farmer's legacy wasn't just the land tilled beneath him. It was the legacy of nurturing souls that blossomed alongside the crops. And in that understanding lay the true strength of a man who stood against the storm, fiercely guarding not only his farm but the hope for a better life for all. The moon hung high and full in the sky, casting a silvery light over the quiet countryside. But beneath this serene facade, danger brewed on the edge of the road. Shadows crept closer to the old farmhouse, where a dilapidated barn sat slightly askew on its foundation, a relic of a time when the farm flourished with life. 3 figures hid amongst the fields, their hearts pounding in unison. They felt invincible, fueled by desperation and the promise of easy cash. The leader, Tommy, a rough-edged man with a weathered face, whispered to the others, "This place looks empty. Just a couple of old tools, maybe a few bucks." Behind him, his friends, Mike and the younger, more anxious Jake, exchanged uncertain glances. Shadows flickered like ghosts as they huddled, plotting their audacious move. Jake, his hands shaking, peered through the cracked window of the farmhouse. "Relax, it's just an old barn and a rusty tractor," Tommy said, masking his own uncertainty with bravado. But beyond that frail facade of confidence, something was stirring inside the farmhouse, a presence waiting and watching. Inside, Marvin, the farmer, knew every inch of his land, every sound that echoed after dark. He had spent countless nights awake, battling the anxiety that came with relentless storms and unforeseen challenges. He leaned against the wall of his kitchen, the warmth of the single light bulb illuminating a face carved by years of hard work. He felt that something was about to happen. He could sense it in the air. The 3 would-be robbers approached the back door, hearts racing with anticipation. Tommy stepped forward and flung the door open, expecting nothing but emptiness will greet them. Instead, the faint sound of a creaking floorboard in the distance froze their blood. Marvin's voice boomed out of the shadows, fierce and immediate. The farm breathed with resilience, echoing Marvin's strength. The trio stared wide-eyed into the darkened kitchen, surprise etched across their faces. Their confidence evaporated like mist under the morning sun. Tommy regained his composure just long enough to try and play it cool. We were just looking for some stuff," Marvin said, stepping into the light, his presence a solid wall of defiance. He wasn't just a simple farmer, he was a man forged in the fires of experience. Shadows no longer intimidate him. Jake took a half step back, feeling the weight of the moment. "This is just a mistake." "We can leave," he stammered, the bravado that had driven them tapering into uncertainty. Through the silence that followed, Marvin could hear their hearts racing like wild horses. It was a visceral reminder that beneath the bravado, fear drove these boys. They weren't just robbers, they were victims of a world that had pushed them to a desperate edge. "Boys," Marvin continued, taking a measured step forward, wielding power like a shield. "You don't want to make this choice. You're better than this." He had lived with less than a few dollar bills in his pocket before. He knew hunger, but there was strength in staying true to oneself. The magic of resilience hadn't abandoned him, nor did he expect it to be absent from them. But the tension in the air thickened as Tommy's face hardened. "We're not looking for a lecture, old man." In that moment, Marvin understood he was facing not just frightened young men, but a storm of choices that had led them to this point. He saw the hunger in their eyes, the desperation clawing for a way out. "You don't want to do this. Trust me," he implored, his tone shifting from defiance to compassion. Tommy scoffed, taking a menacing step closer. Marvin felt a cloud of indignation wash over him. He shook his head slowly, knowing he needed to stand his ground, not just for himself, but for the very essence of what it meant to fight for what was right. With a swift motion, he reached for the heavy iron skillet resting on the counter, raising it as a symbol of defense, of farmer's last line of protection against those who sought to intrude upon the hollows of his existence. The boys reeled back, shock spreading across their faces, but within that flash of fear, a glimmer of hesitation flickered. Too many years had trained Marvin for this moment, and he could hear every lesson reverberating within him: courage, resilience, and the will to protect. "Don't push me," Marvin warned, his voice low but steady. Little did they know that deep within, Marvin was reminding himself as much as them that choices matter. Before them lay two paths, one leading to chaos, the other to understanding, if they chose to step off the precipice of violence. Tommy blinked rapidly, his bravado faltering. He shouted, but behind him, Jake began to falter, a swath of doubt cutting through the bravado. Marvin's thoughts raced as he saw the cracks forming in their facade. "Leaving this behind is a choice," he urged. Tommy spat, desperate and angry. Marvin shot back, the iron skillet lowered but ready to ascend once again if necessary. They were standing on the edge of a decision, and he could feel it in the air. Were they determined to make this moment their life's defining instant? As uncertainty washed over them, the tension in the kitchen became an entity unto itself. Marvin's heart raced, not with fear of violence, but a deep-seated empathy that urged him to connect. They were trapped, but he didn't have to confront them with violence. There was power in the choice of compassion. He turned to Tommy. Tommy's expression shifted again, faced with a real choice, the opportunity to flee the darkness they had been running toward. "What?" he growled, anger flaring. But where Jake saw despair, Mike suddenly saw hope. "We could just go. There's nothing here, just..." Marvin thundered, breaking through their turmoil. "That door leads to a life of regret where you'll always find yourself running. It's not just tonight, it's everything that brought you here." The room shrank around them, hearts beating like war drums. And for just a moment the world stood still, a fragile silence binding them together in anticipation. Tommy, torn between the remnants of bravado and the wisdom in Marvin's fervent words, hesitated. In that flicker of doubt, Jake seized the opportunity. The internal conflict simmered. Tommy snapped, rage bubbling beneath the surface. But even he felt the shift within the weight of their choices crushing down upon them, mingling with the echo of Marvin's voice. "Run, boys, while you still can," Marvin urged again, his tone softer yet still carrying the weight of a man who stood his ground. And just like that, the warmth of hope flickered to life. With a flash of realization, the boys turned as one. They dashed toward the door, hearts pounding, breaths quickening. The world outside was calling. The storm loomed beyond the threshold, but so did the chance to escape a life of darkness. Tommy shouted, clutching at fleeting pride, but the shadows of desperation lost their grip. They pushed through, escaping the suffocating despair of their previous choices. Marvin stayed still for a moment, watching them vanish into the night, the weight of their absence resonating in the silence that filled the farmhouse. He leaned against the cool wall, feeling a strange mix of relief and heartache. His mind whirled with thoughts of hope and compassion. Despite how they had approached him, he sensed the desperation woven into their souls. They were not merely thieves. They were lost children seeking a way out, a way back to light. Outside, thunder rumbled ominously in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall. They echoed like soft whispers of solace as Marvin exhaled deeply. The world was alive beneath layers of darkness, and he felt certain that one day they might make their way back, not as thieves, but as men seeking redemption. The tension that once filled the farmhouse melted away, replaced by an unexpected serenity. He would always be ready to defend his domain, to protect what was his. But perhaps tonight was about more than mere survival. It was about understanding, teaching, and awakening something in those lost boys. As rain began to fall lightly outside, washing away the remnants of fear and uncertainty, Marvin turned away from the door, knowing that the storm would soon pass but leaving a message of hope echoed in his heart. Tomorrow would come with challenges anew, perhaps another storm, perhaps another test. But he was ready, because even on the darkest nights, the light of understanding flickers bright. And even if shadows creep closer, resilience will always rise to greet the dawn. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the overgrown fields. Crickets chirped softly in the growing dusk, and the air was thick with the smell of freshly turned earth. As the last rays of sunlight faded, three figures crept through the tall grass, their hearts pounding in synchronicity. They were drawn together by desperation and the flickering hope of quick cash. Whispered Jake, the youngest, his voice trembling slightly. Tommy, the leader, replied, a hint of irritation creeping into his tone. Look around, will you? An old farmhouse and a few rusty tools. Mike, standing behind them, glanced around nervously. I don't know, guys. Tommy shot back, his determination propelling them forward despite the creeping doubts gnawing at his gut. We go in, grab what we can, and get out. Reaching the back door, Tommy paused briefly. He could feel his heart thudding against his chest, but he quickly dismissed it. On three, he whispered, adrenaline surging through him. 1, 2. With a quick shove, he threw the door open. The old hinges creaked ominously, echoing through the empty space like an alarm bell. The kitchen lay before them, dimly lit and filled with the remnants of a life once vibrant. As they crossed the threshold, the stillness enveloped them, thick and suffocating. Marveling at the farmhouse's worn features, they barely noticed Marvin, a rugged farmer in his late 50s, standing just out of sight in the shadows, waiting. He had seen them approach, quiet as whispers marking their every motion. Years of hard labor had ingrained countless instincts into him. He knew when trouble was lurking, and tonight he was prepared. Tommy stepped further inside, the floorboards creaking underfoot. The boys looked around, eyes wide with anticipation, scanning for anything of value. Mike muttered, disappointment creeping into his voice. Just keep looking. It's got to be here somewhere, Tommy urged, determination flickering like the dying light. Just then Marvin stepped into sight, silhouetted by the weak glow of the kitchen light. Evening, fellas, he said, his voice calm but carrying an underlying current of authority. The boys froze, the air thick with tension. Time seemed to stretch into eternity. They hadn't expected to run into anyone. Jake stammered, his bravado fading instantly, replaced by the chill of fear. Trying to rob my home. You picked the wrong place, Marvin said, stepping forward, confidence radiating off him like heat from an open flame. Look, we're just looking for a little cash, Tommy blurted out, struggling to mask his own fear. Marvin shook his head, unyielding. You think it's just about money? You've crossed into my space. This is my life, my legacy you're trying to take. His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. The implication stirred something deep within each of them. They had come hoping for an easy score, but now found themselves facing a man who embodied everything they lacked: strength, purpose, and resolve. Let's just get this over with, Tommy snapped, the bravado returning in waves, but the steel in Marvin's eyes held firm. Do you really want to do this? You're not just stealing from me, you're stealing from yourselves. His calm demeanor rattled the intruders even more. They had painted him as nothing more than an old farmer, someone easy to intimidate, but here he stood, a formidable force. Suddenly, emotions roiled within Jake. I just wanted to help my family, he murmured, conflict splattering across his face, the guilt gnawing at his insides. Help them, Marvin pressed, catching the young man's eye. You want to make your life better, you have to earn it. Tommy, feeling the ground slip from under him, stepped forward, fists clenched. We need this. You don't know what it's like. Just give us what you have and we'll leave, he demanded, voice rising. Is that the solution you want? Marvin countered, his tone steady as a rock. Understanding flashed in his eyes as he recognized the battle within them. They were not just robbers, they were lost souls wrestling with their choices. The tension in the air thickened, heavy with impending violence. Tommy's bravado cracked for just a moment, revealing a glimpse of the fear hidden beneath all that rage. He exclaimed, his voice wavering as his bravado eroded. "What's fair is a choice," Marvin said, his voice unwavering. In an instant, discussions of courage and resilience transformed into tumult. Time stood still as fear mingled with desperation. As Marvin stood tall, he sensed the unease permeating the atmosphere, weaving through each interaction like a dangerous current. Jake's internal struggle intensified, a battle between right and wrong. The words of his parents echoed in his mind, the teachings of hard work clashing against the temptations of easy money. He said suddenly, stepping back as realization dawned. "You don't have to," Marvin urged, his tone softer now, forged with empathy. "You can find another way. You don't have to be defined by this moment." Tommy, fueled by insecurity, exploded. "There's nothing else for us." He thrust his arm forward, anger swirling like a storm. Marvin stood firm, unyielding. "And yet you stand in my home trying to take what isn't yours." But as the storm of whispering emotions and escalating tensions reached a breaking point, something changed. Jake, torn between his friends and the clarity of Marvin's words, stepped towards them. "Maybe we should just leave," he suggested, his voice wavering. Tommy sneered. "And let him win," but Mike had seen enough. "Let's go, Tommy." He felt the fear creeping in, urging him to retreat from the darkness of their choices. Tommy spat, his voice shaking with rage, but insecurity clawed its way to the surface as he considered their retreat. Fear battled against bravado, and the weight of his choices pressed down like the crushing dark. "Walk away," Marvin said, unwavering, almost pleading with them now. The room pulsed with tension, hearts thudding in the shared silence. Jake's eyes darted between his friends and the wise farmer standing before them. It was a choice that weighed upon them like a storm cloud ready to unleash its fury. "Let's go," Jake repeated, now echoing with conviction. "Me neither," Mike added, stepping away from the chaos. In a moment of clarity, the grip of desperation began to slip, revealing the path of new choices. Tommy's shoulders slumped, the fight leaving him. "You're not leaving me behind," he growled, but the defiance in his voice that once rang so strong had dissolved into something softer. The three turned as one, dashing for the door, their feet pounding against the wooden floor. Marvin felt a surge of relief. The power of choice had triumphed over the grip of greed and desperation. Marvin watched them flee into the dark, hearts racing, shadows swallowing them whole. He stood silently for a moment, a grim resolve settling over him. Though he had faced them down, he felt their pain linger in the air. The storm outside grew louder, rain drumming against the windows as Marvin settled back against the counter. The warmth of the kitchen enveloped him. He understood then that the battle wasn't just against those boys. It was against an unrelenting cycle of desperation that pushed them to choose darkness over light. Tomorrow would bring another day, another challenge, and no doubt the echoes of this night would resonate long after. But perhaps somewhere in their escape, they would find the courage to choose differently. Perhaps they would shed the darkness and seek out the light. And so, as the thunder rumbled outside, Marvin stood firm, aware of the weight of his actions, a protector of dreams and hopes, ready for whatever came next, a guardian not just of his land, but of the lives entwined within it. The world outside was unforgiving, but within the walls of that little farmhouse, hope flickered like a candle, steady and strong against the night. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. The rural landscape stood tranquil, the kind of serene setting that wrapped a person in its warmth. But beneath that calm exterior, tension lurked like a snake in the grass. Tommy, a wiry figure with a restless demeanor, crouched low among the tall weeds that bordered the old farm. "This place looks abandoned," he said, glancing nervously at his two companions. His voice trembled with anxious excitement. "Yeah, man, it's an easy score," Mike, a more substantial guy with a flat cap pulled low over his brow, replied, trying to mask his own hesitations. Jake, the youngest of the trio, took a step back, his instincts screaming at him. He whispered, uncertainty cloaking his words. "Relax," Tommy snapped, straightening up, his bravado overwhelming the doubt. "It's just an old farmhouse." With that, they moved forward, creeping toward the back door like shadows slipping through the twilight. Inside the farmhouse, Marvin sat quietly in the dim light, his heart steady behind calloused hands. He had lived through many storms, both in nature and in life, and tonight, He felt the air thrum with an impending confrontation. He was no stranger to fear, having battled it for years on his farm. He had fought storms that carved through his fields and animals that needed nursing back to health. As the sun set and the quiet stretched thin, he had sensed something was off. Years of experience had taught him to listen to those instincts. The creak of the old door echoed like thunder in the stillness. Tommy pushed it open just as Marvin rose from his chair, his figure illuminated in the pale glow of the kitchen light. Instinctively, he positioned himself between the intruders and the heart of his home. "Evening, boys," Marvin greeted, quiet confidence lacing his voice. The three men froze, already caught in the act. They had expected an empty shell, a ghost town. What they found was a living, breathing soul. Tommy stuttered, trying to regain his composure. The bravado from earlier was crashing down around him like old plaster. Marvin asked, stepping closer, a slight challenge lacing his words. He felt an ache in his chest, not for himself, but for these boys. Could see it etched in their faces: desperation, fear, loss. "Look, this isn't what it seems," Mike said, his voice quaking slightly. Marvin shook his head, his eyes piercing through the facade. "Cash, you think that's what you need? You're here standing in my home trying to take what isn't yours." The weight of Marvin's words hung in the air, thick and heavy. The young men had painted him as vulnerable, just another easy target. Yet before them stood a man forged in grit and heart, ready to stand his ground. Tommy shouted, his bravado creeping back in, masking the uncertainty boiling beneath his surface. "You don't want to do this, son," Marvin replied, his tone unyielding yet softened by a flicker of empathy. "You don't understand the path you're on." Tommy scoffed, emboldened by desperation. "You don't know us." Marvin sighed, knowing too well the truth behind those desperate eyes. "You think what you're doing will solve your problems. It won't." Jake looked from Marvin to Tommy, confusion dawning within him. "Maybe we should just go," he suggested softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. The thought of turning back skittered across his mind, but Tommy's intense gaze urged him to hold firm. "No," Tommy barked, the urgency to maintain control stirring the simmering anger inside him. In that moment, he stepped forward, clenched fists ready, fueled by fear and pride. Marvin sensed the escalating tension, adrenaline racing through him. He had been in confrontations before, but this time felt different. It felt as though the very fabric of their futures was woven into this moment. "You have a choice," Marvin said, his voice steady, filled with a wisdom born from years of toil and struggle. Silence gripped the room as Tommy faltered, a flicker of doubt carving itself into his hardened expression. The fear clutched at Jake's heart as fresh desires wrestled against the weight of despair. Marvin asked, the intensity of his gaze unwavering. The echoes of his past, the struggles and failures flashed before him like a film strip, pushing him to stand firm against the tide. Tommy's confidence cracked slightly as he regarded his friends. Jake took a shaky breath, and in that moment of uncertainty, he saw not just the farmer before him, but a man embodying resilience. In a desperate move, Tommy lunged forward, but the momentary hesitation shook him. Marvin was ready. He pivoted, reaching for the heavy frying pan resting on the counter, brandishing it not with malice but with determination. Marvin warned, the voice of an empowered guardian echoing in the space between them. "I don't want to hurt you." The kitchen was charged with electricity. The tension pulsed like a heartbeat, each moment more palpable than the last. Tommy stumbled back, anger mixed with fear swirling in his gut. His bravado had been stripped bare, revealing his vulnerability. Jake urged, tearing his gaze away from the confrontation but driven by a stronger impulse to flee. Marvin stepped closer, his demeanor easing, grounding the moment. "You don't have to be defined by what led you here." Tommy's resolve faltered further. He spat, but the anger lacked substance. He turned to Mike, trying to read his thoughts, searching for support amidst the chaos. "Maybe he's right," Mike offered cautiously, the fear gripping him, siphoning strength from his bravado. For the first time, they paused, evaluating their choices. Marvin stood tall, embodying the hope they all desperately needed amidst the devastation of their intentions. "Walk away. Find something good in this life," Marvin urged. "You can be strong without hurting others." The words struck Jake's core, igniting the hope that had dimmed inside him. "I'm done," he shouted suddenly. the resolve breaking free from his chest. The others hesitated, uncertainty clouding their judgment as they stood in the precarious balance of anger and clarity. Leave with your pride intact, don't let this define you, because it can lead you down a path of darkness, Marvin said, allowing the conflict within them to collide with the truth of his words. Tears of frustration welled in Tommy's eyes, the fear of being boxed into a cycle of crime clouding his vision. He murmured, that flicker of doubt transforming into true reflection. You can start by stopping right now, Marvin replied gently. Take a chance on yourselves. As the escalating weight of uncertainty bore down on them, Jake turned and urged the others, let's go, before it's too late. With an unsteady pulse of adrenaline, Tommy turned to look at his friends, neon regrets flashing before him like road signs warning against a perilous turn. They bolted, dashing toward the door, the sound of rustling grass and heavy breaths echoing in the stillness. Marvin stepped aside, letting them pass, the weight of the moment shifting from confrontation to relief. He watched with a heart that pounded not with anger but the promise of redemption unfolding before him. They were running into the night, escaping the web of choices they had nearly ensnared themselves in. Once outside, the cool air rushed over them, a stark awakening from a dream turned nightmare. They fell into the shadows, hearts racing, each footstep carrying them further from the brink. Marvin wondered aloud as he observed their fleeing figures silhouetted against the twilight. His own heart settled, knowing he had offered them a chance, a flicker of hope in a moment filled with darkness. They would have to find their own way back, but perhaps their paths would include seeking out the light. With the echoes of their retreat fading into the distance, Marvin felt a sense of calm wash over him. He returned to the kitchen, heart heavy but filled with purpose. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, and the burden of life would continue to press upon him. He stood by the window, the moonlight gleaming like silver across the land, a reminder that darkness is but a fleeting illusion. Hope would always linger just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to reach out and grasp it. Marvin turned from the window, feeling renewed energy coursing through him. He would work the land, tend to the crops, and face whatever storms might arise. After all, he was not just a farmer. He was a guardian, a protector of dreams, ready for whatever lay ahead, ready for the next chapter in his enduring story. The moon hung high in the sky, shrouded in a veil of ominous clouds that flickered like ghosts dancing across the darkened landscape. Below, an old farmhouse stood lonely among sprawling fields, its cracked windows revealing nothing of the life it contained. The air was thick with tension, as if the land itself held its breath. 3 figures crept through the tall grass, shadows gliding over the earth, hearts pounding in unison. Tommy, the leader, felt the weight of desperation pressing against his chest. "This place looks deserted," he whispered, scanning the crumbling structure ahead, his voice a mixture of excitement and doubt. "Yeah, just an old farm," replied Mike, his eyes darting nervously. "No one's gonna be home." Jake, the youngest and the most anxious, hesitated at the edge of the shadows. He murmured, fear lacing his words. Tommy snapped, brushing aside Jake's worries. "We'll get in, grab what we can, and get out." Instinctively, Jake felt the knot in his stomach tight. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But just then they heard a faint rustle behind them, a sound that sent their hearts racing. Out of the corner of his eye, Jake saw a figure silhouetted against the barn, a man wrapped in shadows. He gasped. Tommy hissed, his bravado faltering ever so slightly. Moving closer, they reached the back door, the ancient wood weathered and worn. Tommy stepped forward, ready to shove it open, and just as he did, the door swung ajar, creaking ominously on its hinges. The sight before them was unexpected, a simple kitchen filled with old pots and worn furniture. Dust motes floated in the air, glimmering in what little light slipped through the cracked windows. But then, a voice shattered the stillness. They froze, hearts stopping in their chests. The voice belonged to Marvin, an imposing figure standing in the shadows, a man defined not just by his years, but by every challenge he had faced on that land. He was the guardian of this farm. Tommy stumbled over his words, adrenaline flooding his system. "We didn't mean any harm, we just thought," Marvin concluded, stepping forward, revealing the strength in his broad shoulders and the shrewdness etched in his weathered face. Mike's voice trembled slightly as he glanced at his friends, anxiety pooling in his gut. "Desperation doesn't justify your actions," Marvin replied, his voice steady and unyielding. The atmosphere seemed to thicken as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Tommy, realizing the weight behind Marvin's words, felt uncertainty trickle in. "We're just trying to get by," he retorted, an edge of defiance creeping into his tone. "I've lived through storms worse than this," Marvin shot back, the intensity in his eyes unwavering. "You think taking from me will change your lives? It won't." For a brief moment, a flicker of empathy passed through the air. Inside, Jake felt his conviction begin to waver, doubt gnawing at his resolve. "We just need some cash, man," he blurted, his voice cracking. "Cash?" Marvin stepped closer, his presence radiating strength. "You're standing at a crossroads." Tommy scoffed, but a moment of vulnerability flashed across his face. "I know that facing the truth takes more courage than running away," Marvin replied, his voice calm, filled with conviction. The tension in the room reached a fever pitch as the conflict swirled like a whirlwind around them. Time felt suspended, their fates dangled in the balance. "Tommy, we should go," Jake said suddenly, his resolve finally breaking free. "What?" Tommy's eyes narrowed, rage and confusion battling within him. Jake's voice rose, raw with urgency. "I don't want to do this anymore." Marvin watched their faces twist with anger and fear. He realized they were standing on the edge of a precipice, grappling with choices that could define their lives forever. "You have the power to choose differently," he said, his tone steady yet filled with understanding. Tommy clenched his fists, struggling against the tide of his emotions. "You can't just talk us out of this," he growled. "All you have is this moment," Marvin replied, his voice echoing in the tension-filled room. The words reverberated in each of their minds, stirring latent doubts and passions like embers in a forgotten fire. Then suddenly, one of the shelves creaked ominously, breaking the spell of their standoff. The sound startled all four of them, tension spiraling like a chain reaction. Tommy, pushed to the brink, stepped forward, palms clenched. He shouted, throwing his hands up in frustration. Marvin remained unfazed, standing as a pillar of resilience. "You think reaching for vengeance will heal your wounds? It won't. Look where we are." But Tommy was too far gone, anger blinding him to the truth. He yelled, lunging forward, desperation overpowering common sense. In a blur of motion, Marvin grabbed the heavy frying pan from the counter, lifting it with a commanding presence. "You don't want to go down this path, son," he warned. The faces of the boys shifted, torn between fear and defiance. Jake felt his heart race as he realized what was happening, the bracing clash of two worlds as they teetered on the edge of violence. He shouted, but before anyone could react, Tommy lunged at Marvin, rage overtaking his senses like an uncontrolled fire. And in that instant, the frying pan swung upward, ready to protect all that Marvin held dear. The connection shook the house, each heartbeat echoing like a drum in the stillness. As the pan met Tommy's shoulder with a hard thud, he stumbled back, surprise flooding his features. The impact vibrated through Marvin's arm, but he held firm, fear behind him transforming into a relentless courage. Jake screamed, stepping forward instinctively, his heart pounding. Marvin yelled, the firmness of his voice cutting through the turmoil. Tommy clutched his shoulder, eyes wide with shock and pain, but a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Perhaps in a twisted way, Marvin was right. But as adrenaline thundered through him, he felt the embers of rage still flickering within. Mike murmured, his voice shaky, realizing they were now embroiled in chaos where there had once been an opportunity to escape. Marvin, sensing the shift, lowered the pan slightly but kept his guard up. "It's not too late, you still have a chance." But Tommy glared back, pain morphing into fury. "No." As they faced off, the night thickened around them, the stakes higher than ever. Time slowed as desperation dripped from every word, mixing with regret and the haunting echo of choices left unmade. Jake urged, his voice rising in panic, realizing the fine line they stood on. But the fear of losing Tommy, of watching his friend spiral deeper into violence, tethered him. And then, like a bolt from the blue, there was a bang. Someone was outside. A sudden thump, heavy footsteps muffled by the gravel, shattered the tension like glass. Marvin shouted, his heart racing, instinct kicking in. Tommy turned to Mike, eyes wide. Yes, Mike breathed, fear shaking his voice. As they spun toward the door, the unmistakable sound of sirens pierced the night air, echoing hauntingly across the landscape. A plaintive wail beckoned closer, slicing through the chaos, a cruel reminder of the stakes they had entered. Tommy's voice shook, a thin veneer of bravado now stripped away. Marvin's eyes narrowed, adrenaline pumping through his veins. You have a choice to make now. Voices and lights approached from the distance, illuminating the edges of the farmhouse like a judgment letter written in light. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in the air. Their lives dangled precariously, the road ahead tangled with fear, regret, and choices that could lead to a path of horror or redemption. Marvin shouted, his voice breaking through the crescendos of fear. And as the headlights of the approaching cars neared, they could feel the walls closing in, the opportunity for escape or confrontation fading into the night. Tommy made eye contact with Jake, a surge of realization washing over them both. Outside, the sirens wailed like banshees in the night. Shadows crept closer, darkness wrapping around them like a tightening noose. In that moment, a decision loomed, heavy and ethereal, ready to define their lives in a way they could never have imagined. Would they surrender to their shadows, or would they step into the light and reclaim their lives? As the sirens drew nearer, the tension reached its zenith, the world hanging in a fragile balance. The choice was theirs to make, but time was running out.